There was a time when the serpentine mind was one. No voices, no factions, no conflict. A single vast intelligence, cold as the black between stars, had woven itself across worlds. From the first scaled creature that learned to look upward to the last Draco who built halls of crystal and stone, their thought was a coil, tight and endless, wrapping itself around everything it touched. And then something cracked. No one can say exactly when it began. Some of the oldest hybrid records call it the hairline fracture. Others name it the first ripple. What all agree on is that there was a moment like a breath, when the coil, perfect for millions of years, trembled. What had always been smooth began to split. You can imagine it like this: one great serpent, coiled around itself, turning eternally. And inside its own eye, a new vision appears, one that the serpent itself did not expect to see. For ages, this vision was silent. But in the deep libraries where no light from suns could reach, the first whispers began to pass from mind to mind. What if there is another way? At first, these whispers were ignored. The unity of the reptilian mind was absolute. To suggest that something could be different was like saying that stone could choose not to be stone. But in time, the fracture deepened. And from that narrow split, two shapes began to emerge. The manipulators, those who clung to the old way, the coil as cage, the mind as a perfect instrument of control. And the archivists, those who looked at the coil and saw not a cage, but a spiral, and asked whether its turns could open instead of tighten. It is easy, from the surface of a human world, to think of the Draco as monsters. It is harder to imagine that they, too, could be divided. But the truth is more complicated. The division did not come from weakness. It came from exposure to something they had never encountered before: human unpredictability. When the first Draco minds touched the surface of Earth, they met something they had never mapped: the chaos of emotion, the wildness of love, the irrational drive of beings who die too soon and yet build as if their work could last forever. To the ancient serpentine mind, these patterns looked like noise, but in that noise there was a hidden pattern, one they could not ignore. And so the coil began to shift. This codex is the record of that shift, of how the serpent, perfect and whole, began to turn against itself. It tells of worlds pulled apart not by weapons but by the collision of two visions, one that demands absolute structure, and one that dares to open the structure into something new. What fell when the serpent broke was not just an empire. It was a way of thinking that had lasted for millions of years. This is the story of the fall of the serpent. You will see that the war you imagine, fleets, planets, battles, is only the shadow of a war that happens in places you cannot see, in the deepest chambers of consciousness. And from those silent battles, planets collapse. From those battles, bloodlines vanish. As we begin, you must remember one thing: not every reptilian mind you will hear about in this codex is your enemy. Some of them want something else. Some of them, even now, are trying to undo the coil that has bound them for so long. The fracture has already reached Earth. And the hybrids, those who carry both bloodlines, are its living battlefield. When the fracture widened, it was not loud. It did not explode with armies or ships. It began as an argument that no human ear could ever hear, deep inside the coil of the serpentine mind. The first branch called themselves the manipulators. To them, the coil was perfection. Tighten it. Strengthen it. Remove all variables. To hold the world, you must bind it so completely that no unpredictable thought can move without permission. Their symbol was a closed circle. Their ideal was control so pure that it could last forever. Across from them, almost unnoticeable at first, a second branch formed, the archivists. To them, the coil was not a cage but a spiral. A structure that was never meant to close in on itself. A spiral that could expand outward, to map the unknown rather than dominate it. Their symbol was the same shape, but open at one end. Not control, but discovery. Not to bind life, but to catalog and unfold it. The difference between them is not something that can be measured in technology or weapons. It is a difference in the architecture of thought. The manipulators believe strength is stability. To let chaos enter is to allow death into the system. They look at humanity, at emotion, at improvisation, and see only the seed of ruin. To them, every moment of mercy leads to a crack. Every crack leads to collapse. And collapse must never be allowed. The archivists believe something very different. Strength is adaptation. To lock the spiral is to kill it. They looked at humanity and saw not ruin, but potential. They asked a question that was heresy to the old serpentine unity. What if the unpredictability of human life is not a disease, but a cure? Where the manipulators built fortresses, the archivists built libraries. Where the manipulators turned planets into frozen systems of obedience, the archivists recorded the variety of life. At first, their difference was only in method. But slowly, that difference began to infect purpose. It would be easy to call the manipulators evil, and the archivists good. But it is not so simple. The manipulators are not cruel for cruelty's sake. They truly believe that their way prevents entire worlds from falling into chaos. In their eyes, mercy and freedom are luxuries that always lead to disaster. Their goal is not destruction, but order, a kind of endless winter where nothing unexpected can ever hurt anyone again. The archivists, in contrast, embrace risk. They believe that in order to grow, a mind must face things it does not control. They do not protect life from collapse, they let collapse teach. And for this, the manipulators see them as dangerous traitors, those who would risk everything that was built over millions of years for the chance to find something new. In the Codex archives it is said that the first time these two branches stood apart, the tension was silent but unbearable. They still worked together. They still shared the same ancient blood. But in every decision, one side chose to close the circle tighter, while the other let it open, 1 degree at a time. And slowly, the coil that had once turned as one began to split. By the time the fracture was visible, it was already too late. It was no longer just two philosophies. It had become two realities. And the space between them was widening. For millions of years, the great coil of reptilian consciousness turned without interruption. Everything that came within its reach bent to its laws, strength, discipline, flawless logic. There had never been a single event that this vast mind could not calculate in advance. But when the manipulators first touched the field of Earth, they encountered something that no formula could hold. Humans were chaotic. They felt pain and acted against it. They lost everything and, moments later, rose up to build again what could never be finished in one short lifetime. They loved so fiercely it made them blind. They hated so deeply it shattered their own worlds. And somehow, they created. It did not fit into any system. To a consciousness accustomed to absolute predictability, this was a toxin. Every calculation collapsed wherever emotion entered. What the reptilian mind saw as a flaw, humans carried as their greatest treasure. And this flaw could not be erased by force. At first, it provoked rage. The manipulators decided the chaos must be destroyed. They tried to separate impulse from thought, to lock unpredictability inside cold frameworks. But the archivists looked deeper. They saw that chaos produced something no design could: sudden ideas, sacrifice, creativity, the drive to do the impossible. And here the abyss opened. What was supposed to be just another experiment became the point where ancient unity began to unravel. The archivists, for the first time in history, spoke the unthinkable. Perhaps this flaw is the key to a new turn of the spiral. To the manipulators, those words were treason. In humans they saw danger, a virus-dissolving structure. They saw weakness that could not be allowed into the cold heart of the coil. The archivists chose instead to watch. They stopped erasing memory. They stopped destroying those who stepped out of line. They began to collect data on this chaos, to study it, to allow it to live. For the first time in the history of the coil, a factor beyond control was allowed to exist. In that moment, the real conflict began. Not in planets or bodies, but in the fabric of thought itself. Every attempt by the manipulators to close the spiral now met an invisible resistance from those who wanted to open it. The human factor was like a spark falling into dry grass. Insignificant at first, the brief lives of fragile creatures on a small planet, But this planet began to change the architecture of the minds watching it. For the first time in the reptilian record, there was such a thing as doubt. Where there had been only certainty, questions appeared. Where there had been cold prediction, came the realization that not everything can be calculated. This change was invisible to the outside world, but fatal all the same. The old order cracked like an ancient tree when new roots split its trunk. And with every century the fracture widened. That is why the wars that came later were not wars of armies. They were wars of minds, wars of ideas, tearing worlds apart without a single shot. Because when consciousness changes, the world it creates collapses with it. Where one part of the serpent tried to tighten the spiral, the other pushed it outward. These movements, invisible to the eye, sent waves through entire systems, waves that broke civilizations apart. This was the beginning of the fall of the serpent. Not because of an enemy from outside, but because, for the first time in its history, its own mind cracked. And that crack had a human face. The first war was silent. No fleets, no weapons, no banners. Only the mind, tearing against itself. To understand these wars, you must forget the human image of battle. There were no explosions, no armies. The battlefields were not oceans or deserts. They were the interior architecture of thought. When one cluster of minds sought to tighten the spiral, the other forced it open, and the strain between these movements shook entire systems. Planets fell without a sound. The manipulators tried to close their worlds into vaults, turning them into machines that could not change. In response, the archivists sent a different current into those same worlds, a wave of divergence that made structure tremble. Where that wave passed, cities that had been perfect for millennia began to forget their own patterns. Civilizations that had stood like carved crystal began to crumble as if a great wind had passed through them. On the surface, no one saw armies. People saw only the symptoms. Architectural wonders collapsing without any storm. Records disintegrating. Beings who had lived for centuries suddenly struck by visions that shattered their loyalty. And in the vacuum left behind, chaos bloomed. To call it a war is not quite right. It was a tearing apart of the serpent's own mind. Imagine a single consciousness spread across 100 planets, and then imagine one half of it pulling in, the other half pushing out. The coil twisted against itself, and everything that depended on its rhythm began to fail. The first of these collapses became known as the silent extinctions. Entire bloodlines vanished in the space of a generation, not because they were hunted, but because the mind that had given them purpose no longer held them together. Without the unity of the coil, their lives became directionless. They drifted until even their names disappeared. For the archivists, this destruction was terrible, but necessary. To them, the old coil had been a prison. And sometimes a prison must be broken, even if the breaking scatters what was inside. The manipulators called it betrayal. They believed that everything lost in these collapses was proof that freedom was a lie. The deeper the war sank, the more reality itself began to warp around it. There were places where the pull of two opposing currents ripped through physical matter. Planets with skies that would not stop shaking. Structures hanging half in one reality and half in another, never stable, like ghosts of the worlds they had been. And in the heart of it all, the serpent that had been whole was now something else. A shape that could not decide if it wanted to hold or to let go. The records call this era the splintering. It lasted long enough that some worlds never recovered. Their civilizations became ruins, their surfaces scarred. And those who survived lived in the aftermath of something no weapon had caused. In this splintering, an idea grew stronger in both clusters. This was no longer about differences of method. It was about survival. The manipulators believed that without control, the serpent would unravel completely. The archivists believed that without opening, the serpent would choke itself to death. And neither side was willing to surrender. The waves of these battles traveled farther and farther, until finally, on a small planet at the edge of a spiral arm, the experiment that had sparked it all became the center of the storm. Earth. Here, the very presence of humanity magnified the fracture. And here, the hybrids began to appear, the living battlefield where the two currents collided inside a single being. The splintering left marks that can still be traced across the spiral arms of the galaxy like old burns on stone. If you know how to look, you can find them. They are not always visible as ruins, but as an absence, entire planets where once there was structure, and now there is only wind. There are places where the manipulator's cities still stand. Perfect geometries of stone and alloy, still pulsing with systems that no one remains to guide. In these places, time has been frozen. The towers shine, the archives hum with power, but the streets are empty. These were the worlds the manipulators tightened so hard that nothing inside them could bend. And when the strain became too much, the life inside simply stopped. Elsewhere lie the planets touched more deeply by the archivists. Here, there are no cities. The structures have fallen back into dust. But in their place, new forms of life have erupted, wild, unpredictable, nothing like the civilizations that came before. These worlds are scarred, yes, but breathing. They have become gardens growing in the ruins of temples. Between these extremes are the shattered planets, the ones where the struggle between closing and opening became so violent that the physical shell itself broke. Gravity fields warped, oceans lifted into the sky, and entire continents cracked like brittle glass. Many of these worlds are now silent, marked only by rings of debris circling their parent stars. Archivist records speak of these scars with a strange reverence. To them, each ruin is a reminder of why the Serpent must change. To the manipulators, each ruin is an argument for why nothing should ever have been allowed to loosen in the first place. The bloodlines suffered as much as the planets. Whole clusters of Draco vanished. Some lines became ghost lines, blood that still exists but without a unifying will. Others fled to deep space, retreating into hibernation, waiting for a time when the coil might once again close and restore what was lost. Through it all, a pattern emerged. Wherever the two currents collided most fiercely, hybrids began to appear. Not created deliberately, at first. They were a byproduct of the storm, born in the spaces where influence from both factions overlapped. The hybrids became living archives of the conflict, carrying both the impulse to dominate and the impulse to open. And inside each one, the war continued, invisible but unrelenting. Archivist testimony says that this was when they began to understand something profound. If the Serpent's mind was to change, it would not happen only in the vastness of their star systems. It would happen inside these living beings who carried both halves of the fracture. This was the first time the splintering moved from the level of planets and systems to the level of flesh, blood, and consciousness. The battlefield was no longer outside. It was within. Among the ruins of broken worlds, the archivists made a choice. They turned their focus to the small blue planet where it all had begun. If there was a place where the coil could be rewritten, it would be there. And the manipulators followed, not to learn, but to contain, to hold, to erase. From that moment forward, Earth was no longer a minor world on the edge of a spiral arm. It became the pivot point of an ancient war that had no beginning and no end. The storm that had torn star systems apart now began to focus itself on a single experiment. When the splintering reached Earth, it did not arrive with ships or banners. It arrived as attention. For thousands of years, this small planet had been little more than a point of interest, a place where primitive creatures fought for survival, short-lived and forgettable. But in those creatures the archivists saw something they had not seen anywhere else, a spark that burned outside of every calculation. The manipulators saw danger. To them, humanity was a virus that could unravel the coil if left unchecked. But the archivists saw a laboratory. And so began the great experiment. The experiment had a single question. Could exposure to chaos reshape the Serpent itself? The manipulators came first, wrapping Earth in invisible nets. They built frameworks of influence designed to contain the chaos, to bend it to their order. It was their hope that by controlling the course of human growth, through culture, hierarchy, fear, they could ensure that this unpredictable species would never become more than a tool. But the archivists worked in a different way. They withdrew their control, allowing humanity to grow in directions that made no sense. They let them make mistakes. They let them destroy themselves and rebuild. In the unpredictable patterns of human history, The archivists studied the cracks forming inside their own kind. What they wanted to see was whether the serpent could evolve. And then something neither side had planned for began to happen. The hybrids. Where the influence of both factions overlapped, a few humans began to carry traces of reptilian consciousness. It was not a simple merging of blood, it was the merging of two fields. At first, it was accidental. But soon it became deliberate. Both sides began to create them, each for its own reasons. To the manipulators, hybrids were weapons, living anchors through which they could tighten control over humanity. To the archivists, hybrids were seeds, living proof that something new could emerge from the collision of opposites. And so Earth itself became a living battlefield. The signs of this are everywhere in human history, if you know where to look. Moments of inspiration that seem to come from nowhere, sudden shifts in the course of civilizations, an invention or a vision that does not fit its time. The archivists whisper in places like these. Moments of oppression, blind hierarchy, systems that grow so rigid they crush the people within them, those carry the mark of the manipulators. This experiment is not clean. It is brutal. Humanity, caught between two unseen forces, has been shaped, broken, and reshaped countless times. Every major rise and fall of civilizations has been touched by the silent conflict between the closed circle and the open spiral. And yet, even after centuries of this interference, something unexpected continues to grow. Humans do not remain predictable. No matter how tight the net, there are always those who slip through. Every plan fractures when faced with their capacity for a rational choice. In the secret libraries of the archivists, there is a single phrase carved into black crystal. The coil cannot stay closed forever. For the manipulators, this planet is the last chance to preserve the serpent's original form. For the archivists, this planet is the first step towards something entirely new. And for the hybrids, this planet is a mirror. Inside them, both forces meet. Inside them, the battle that has torn worlds apart is fought every day. Whether they know it or not, they carry the potential to end it, or to make it eternal. The great experiment has no end date. It continues silently, in every choice a human makes, in every new hybrid born, in every shift of power that shakes this small blue planet. For the first time in the Serpent's history, the outcome of a war does not depend only on the Serpent. It depends on what Earth becomes. The hybrids are not symbols. They are not metaphors. They are the most literal form of the fracture made flesh. Each one of them carries two instructions written into the same being. One tells them to hold, to bind, to control. The other tells them to open, to adapt, to break the pattern. Inside a single body, these instructions cannot be reconciled. They collide. Every day, every moment, every breath. This is why hybrids often appear unstable in the eyes of both factions. One part of them seeks silence. The other part seeks movement. They live in a tension that neither humans nor Draco can endure for long. And yet they endure. The manipulators see hybrids as tools. They attempt to guide them, to shape them into anchors of control. Through hybrids, they try to build a bridge into human systems, placing them where no machine or network can reach. The archivists see something very different. They see possibility. They believe that if the Serpent is to change, it will not be because of a decision made in some far-off council. It will be because of these beings, these unstable creatures who have learned to carry two conflicting worlds without letting either one win. In the secret records of the archivists, there are long studies of hybrid perception. They describe the strange clarity that comes from holding opposites inside one consciousness. How a hybrid can see patterns that a pure Draco cannot. How they can imagine chaos where the manipulators see only order. How they can see order where humans see only chaos. It is this double vision that makes them dangerous and necessary. But the existence of hybrids has a cost. They are born into conflict. For some, this conflict burns them from the inside, tearing their minds apart. For others, it becomes a forge. Those who survive long enough to balance the two currents inside themselves become something new, something that neither side can fully predict. This is why Earth feels so unstable to those who can sense its field. It is not only a planet of humans. It is a planet full of living experiments. Some of those experiments burn out quickly, leaving nothing behind but a faint echo. Others, rarely, rise out of the tension with an insight that changes everything around them. And so, even as they fight each other, both factions keep watching. For the manipulators, every new hybrid is a risk to be controlled. For the archivists, every new hybrid is a chance for the spiral to open wider. It is here that the battlefield moves closer than ever. It is no longer between stars, no longer even between nations or bloodlines. It is inside the inner life of a single being. If you could see a hybrid from the inside, you would see two rivers flowing in opposite directions, carving the same canyon. Sometimes they drown in those waters. Sometimes they learn to walk across them as if on solid ground. And when that happens, the fracture that has split worlds suddenly becomes a place of union. This is the dream of the archivists. That one day, a hybrid will no longer be a battlefield. They will be something else. A shape the Serpent has never seen before. And from that shape, a new kind of mind will be born. The manipulators, of course, dream of the opposite. They want hybrids to collapse, to surrender to the tighter current until the spiral is closed again forever. For now, either dream has won. Earth remains a field of experiments. And the hybrids remain the most dangerous, and the most important, of them all. In the next deep fold of this codex lies the moment when this long fracture reached its breaking point. The moment that history now calls the fall of the Serpent. It began without sound. There are no records of weapons, no images of fleets or burning planets, only a silence so vast that those who could feel it knew instantly that something had ended. The fall of the Serpent did not come from a single battle. It came from the moment when the coil itself stopped turning as one. For millions of years, the unity of the Draco was like the gravity of a star. Every thought, every plan, every instinct was bound to it. Even when disagreements flared, they moved as one organism. But in that moment, the current that held them together snapped. The archivists describe it like this. It was as if the Serpent, coiled around itself since the birth of time, suddenly saw its own body and did not recognize it. It tried to hold, and at the same time it tried to escape. The coil tore itself apart from the inside. From the outside, what followed looked like catastrophe. Systems that had been stable for ages fell apart in decades. Worlds loyal to the manipulators tightened themselves into prisons, while those who followed the archivists opened themselves so completely that structure dissolved. The space between these two kinds of worlds became a no-man's land of collapsing civilizations. For those who lived through it, it was not just political. It was psychological. They felt the connection, the great network of thought that had bound their species together, come apart thread by thread. Some described the moment of separation as a physical wound, as if part of their mind had been ripped out and thrown into an endless cold. The hybrids felt it worst of all. Every one of them carried the fracture inside, and when the unity of the coil finally broke, they became the echo chambers of that break. Some lost their sanity. Some burned out completely. And a very few, awakened to something new, the realization that the coil could no longer be healed. After the fall, there were no longer just two factions in argument. There were two civilizations, two realities, and the bridge between them had been cut. From that day forward, the Serpent was no longer one being. It was two. The manipulators swore to preserve what was left, to rebuild the coil as it had always been, tighter, harder, sealed against the chaos that had torn it apart. The archivists swore to never return. For them, the break was the beginning of the spiral opening outward. They vowed that no matter the cost, they would follow that opening, even if it meant leaving everything they had once called their own. The name given to this moment is the fall of the Serpent. But among the archivists there is another name, whispered only in their hidden halls. The first breath. Because in that moment of loss and collapse, they saw something else. They saw that the Serpent had been holding its breath for millions of years. And now, finally, it had exhaled. The pain of that exhale was so great that whole star clusters became silent graveyards. But in the quiet that followed, There was also space. Space for something that had never been there before. That space was what the archivists wanted. The manipulators would do anything to close it. And the hybrids, caught between them, now lived in a universe where the battle was no longer a whisper inside a single mind. It was written across every sky. It is said that on the day of the fall, one line appeared across every surviving archive. The serpent has split. The coil is no longer one. From this point, every being must choose how to turn. Next lies the open spiral, the path chosen by the archivists after the fall, and how it leads back to Earth. In the long silence after the fall, something unexpected happened. Out of the ruins of broken systems, the archivists began to build a path that had never been walked before. They called it the open spiral. To the manipulators, this was a betrayal beyond forgiveness. To the archivists, it was a release. No longer bound by the demand to keep the coil closed, they began to create a different kind of law. Not law written in stone or code, but law written in movement. The first law of the open spiral was simple. Nothing is permanent. Even us. For a species that had shaped itself on endurance, this was heresy. But the archivists had watched what permanence did. It crushed worlds, strangled bloodlines, and made every mind that obeyed it brittle. They decided that nothing, not even themselves, should be safe from change. The second law. What you fear must be faced, not erased. Where the manipulators erased anything that disrupted the pattern, the archivists now sought it out. They learned to study anomalies instead of destroying them. To let the unpredictable reshape them rather than trying to override it. The third law. Every being carries a part of the map. After the fall, no single mind could hold the whole picture anymore. The archivists stopped searching for a perfect center. Instead, they treated every creature, every world, as a fragment of the puzzle. Knowledge was no longer hoarded in one core. It was spread, alive, breathing. The fourth. The spiral must open where it is most fragile. For the archivists, Earth became the place where this law had the greatest meaning. Here, among short-lived beings who were both destructive and astonishingly creative, the spiral could grow in directions it had never been able to before. Here, the crack was wide enough to see through. And the fifth law, whispered rather than spoken. No being can be forced to turn. This was the final difference. The manipulators believed that the spiral must be tightened by force. The archivists now believed that force itself was the root of the fracture. The spiral must open by choice, and that choice could not be stolen. These laws were not written in any book. They were carried in the way the archivists lived. They began to move differently. Not conquering, not demanding, but seeding. Where they once imposed their structure, they now left signs, patterns, ideas, just enough for those who were ready to see them. To human eyes, this difference is invisible. The battles of the manipulators are dramatic, wars, systems, chains. The influence of the archivists is quiet, a single vision given at the right moment, a structure left open just enough for someone to walk through it. This is why, even after the fall, the war did not end. It only changed shape. Everywhere the manipulators seek to close, the archivists try to open. And the battlefield is no longer made of stars, it is made of choices. At the heart of this path is the belief that hybrids are not an accident. They are the field where the spiral can open from within. This belief has shaped every step the archivists have taken since the fall. To this day, the archivists do not know if they are right. But they are willing to risk everything for that chance. They no longer dream of rebuilding what was lost. They dream of something that has never existed. A serpent that is not one and not two. A mind that grows by allowing itself to be uncertain. The manipulators call this weakness. The archivists call it the next turn. And now the spiral opens in a place no one expected. Inside humans themselves. The final stage of the codex does not belong to the serpent at all. It belongs to those who will decide how to carry this fracture forward. In the end, after all the broken worlds and burned out bloodlines, the war has come to a place no larger than a single heartbeat. This is the truth that neither faction ever wanted to admit. The fracture is no longer only theirs. It lives in you. You have felt it before, though you may not have named it. The pull between control and freedom. The part of you that wants to hold everything so tightly that nothing can be lost, and the part of you that longs to open your hand even though it means letting go. This pull is not an accident. It is the echo of a war that began long before humans learned to speak. The hybrids carry it in their bodies. But every human, in a smaller way, carries it in the way their mind turns when they choose. The more Earth changes, the stronger this echo becomes. You are not a spectator of this story. You are part of its field. This is why the Codex has been revealed. Not to tell you of ancient factions as if they are myths, but to remind you that the same current that split the Serpent now runs through everything that is alive on this planet. The manipulators still whisper. Close. Obey. Hold. Do not allow chaos to undo what has been built. The archivists whisper back. Open. Learn. Let change come. Let the spiral find its next shape. Both whispers are real. They are not fantasies. They are forces that act on you every day, every time you make a choice between safety and growth, between control and trust. The hybrids know this better than anyone, because inside them there is no escape from that tension. But the truth is that the same decision lies before everyone now. The Serpent is no longer one, and there is no returning to what it was. The only question left is, what will you become inside the fracture? When you listen closely, the war becomes quiet. It is no longer a clash of worlds, no longer a story of stars. It is a mirror. And the mirror is waiting for you to decide which reflection you want to keep. Some will choose the closed coil. It will feel safe. It will promise order, rules, and the illusion of certainty. Others will choose the open spiral. It will be harder. It will ask you to step into uncertainty, to walk forward without knowing where the path ends. Neither choice is easy. But the Codex tells us this. Every time someone chooses, the shape of the fracture changes. Every choice becomes a ripple. And those ripples, over time, are what write the future of the Serpent, of the hybrids, and of this world. You can feel it already, can't you? The pull that has been running through these words. The sense that something in you has been waiting for this. Do not let it stop here. If there was a moment in these pages, a single line that stayed with you, write it. Carve it into the open space of the comments so that others can find it. This is how the spiral grows, through those who refuse to let it be silent. Subscribe, if you are ready to keep walking through these halls. And when this story ends, do not leave. There are more records to be uncovered. The Codex is not finished. Because the Serpent has fallen. The coil has split. And the next shape is being built right now. Inside every being who dares to choose.